philosophy in global affairs. I am so excited for today's conversation. How are you doing?
I am fine, thank you, and I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, I am. It's so funny because I write these like little bios out that I'm so excited to read every time. And as I do, I realize how much I don't read out loud. And so I'm like, please don't mess up, please don't mess up. And every single time I'll stumble upon one or two words where I'm like, blah, 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 blah. But I need to practice reading out loud more, I think. I'm actually very excited for today's conversation. I mean, even we were just chatting before hitting the record button. And I think when we talk about race and just our histories, I find it really fascinating. And so you were sharing a bit about how your lineage has come from so many parts of the world. And so I'm really curious to actually start the conversation off by asking, what does the word race mean to you?
Well, the word race to me means a multitude of things. The first thing, of course, is that it functions a lot like what Judith Butler, in her discussion of gender, would call a phantasm. Okay? What I mean by that is that it stimulates fears, but it also stimulates quandary. It also is something where nobody is naturally born with a consciousness of racialization. It's something that happens to you. So it's not like you pop out of your mother's womb and say, well, here's a race, it's somebody else who says that. So, and then there are places where nobody says that at all. As we know, it's hard today for people to imagine that there are people who are still living in the world with no clue of what the hell that thing race is.
Hmm.
And it's very funny because in my childhood, because I was born on the island of Jamaica, when I looked at my family, and we were discussing it earlier, their range was just so far and wide that simultaneously we saw our connection and our differences. I often quip with students, you ever wonder what a group of zebra look like to zebras, or zebras, as they would say in the UK? And students usually get it, that to us they look the same, but to them they look very different.
Hmm.
And every time when friends come and visit someone's home, the first thing visitors often say is, wow, you all look alike. But the family members always say, what are you talking about? We look very different. This already tells you something about us, right? Because race imposes upon many of us a notion of sameness and places difference outside. But actually, the way people live is to see differences inside and tend to place a lot of sameness on people outside. So it subverts our lived reality. In terms of its history, though, I mean, I've written on this topic, as a scholar and all of that. The term itself is a very tricky one, both mythically and historically, okay? Mythically, of course, we start with the fact that the word race is from the word reza. Today, a lot of people say raza because of Portuguese and Spanish, but it was originally reza. Now, reza was a term that was used in medieval Spain and Portugal, particularly in Andalusia, to refer to people who are not Christian, specifically Muslims and Moors. I'm sorry, Muslims and Jews, because Moors were Muslims, okay? Were Muslim. And the term was linked to the Arabic term. Today, some people say Ra, but it's also linked to the term Re, which is related to the Hebrew word Rosh, which means head or the beginning. Now, people would say, well, what the hell does that have to do with race? until you realize that the Christians saw the Muslims and Jews as coming from the southeast. Re is actually going way back in antiquity, all the way to ancient Egypt, all the way to before it was named Egypt, when it was named Kemet, to the sun god, Re. And what we know about the god Re is that Re rises in the east. So you could see these connections in a rather interesting way because it became a marker of foreignness for the Christians.
Mm.
Because it became a way of trying to say these people are from outside. And under Christendom, and when we're referring to Christendom here, we're talking about Christendom as formed in the first 400 years ACE, right? But by 700, Islam emerged. You see? By the 7th century, Islam emerged. And when Islam emerged, there was this problem because Christendom was believed to be the direction of God. If God is in control, then Christendom must triumph. So what is Christendom going to do with 800 years of rule under Muslims? There becomes a conflict that takes the form of what I call theonaturalism, which is the construction of the idea that there is a group of people outside of God, that they're theologically unnatural.
Mm.
If you look at, for instance, the 10th century dictionary of the term reza, this is a dictionary, there are lots of chronicles from the period, but it refers to breeds of horses, dogs, Jews, and Moors. And Moors were Afro-Muslims. So you could see that effort to put people on the level with dogs and horses. It's to signify that real people are in the eyes of God, Christians. Now, in the 15th century, as we know, something happened, which is the conflicts that carried on from the Crusades all the way through took a turn. Isabel and Ferdinand defeated the Moors in Spain. A new stage of the Inquisition came about. And by October of 1492, Columbus landed in the Bahamas and found people who were not Christian, not Jews, and not Moors.
Mm.
These people became a conundrum. It's understood that Jews and Muslims are outside of the eyes of Christian God. But what do you do about these people who've never heard of Christian Jews and Moors? And at first, the presumption was that, as you know, that they were East Indians. But the East Indians with whom these individuals were familiar were what they call Mohammedans, or Muslims. So the term Reza needed to be adjusted. And the adjustment moved from theology into a new naturalism. And this shift took the form of moving from the idea of people outside of the eyes of God to the idea of people who are not really people. So the first thing that one encounters, usually one encounters race negatively. One encounters race with the idea that the racialized person is less of a person and not really a person.
Mm.
And the people with the power to racialize are more of persons, or even worse, above everybody else. And this above creates a form of violence to humanity. Because If you're above humanity, then you're like a god. The notion of being a superior people, even though you have the word people in there, superiority is weird. I mean, how are you born superior? It's just weird. You're, you're, what actions did you have? You're just born. How are you superior? And then the notion that you're born inferior, that's also weird. And this is something in the race context, but as we know, there are other societies with this notion of inferiority by birth and superiority by birth. We were talking about it earlier. And we were talking about in the context of what people call caste, but it's more complex, as we know. Caste is part of it. But the idea of superior people then commits an act of violence against human beings because human beings are fundamentally imperfect. The notion of being a perfect human at this moment makes a group of people designated like demigods. Frantz Fanon had a beautiful way of formulating it. He said, when you create a group of people who are above people, superior, and a group of people who are below people, inferior, you attempt the murder of humanity. So that's, I know, a long answer about some of the things. But I should add that because race is a human-created phenomenon, it doesn't mean that what I've just outlined is the end-all, be-all of the story.
Hmm.
Because as we know, we don't always choose the groups to which we belong, but we choose how we treat members of the groups to which we belong and those to whom we don't belong. So I see race as also creating a profound ethical and political challenge of how we exercise our humanity.
Hmm. Wow. Thank you. One, you speak like Morgan Freeman. It just in the sense of
Oh,
I could fall asleep and just listen to you. I mean, and two, thank you for actually laying out that entire history. I mean, that was fascinating. So I have one question for you, which is when we consider, you brought up casteism, for example, and that is one form of hierarchy of humans that don't necessarily rely. There are colorisms within that, but they don't really rely on your skin tone. It's more about your birth, and it has nothing to do with your ethnicity. And so when it comes to race, even as I think about myself as, am I Indian American American? But what is it actually? Like, is it your skin tone? Is it where you were born? What actually makes up race?
well, race is not simply one thing. Part of it is, for instance, when I told the story of Reza, by the time, remember I said there was 800 years of Afro-Muslim Jewish presence in that part of the world. It's very difficult for people to be hanging out 800 years and don't mix with one another.
Hmm.
So one of the reasons the Inquisition and projects of conversion emerged is because after a while you couldn't tell the difference. As we know, with race, although we talk about color, it's not exclusively about color. There are people, for instance, who are Black, who are blue-eyed and blonde. And there are people who are white, at least legally designated white, who look like you and me. So it's not exclusively a colorism. And within certain groups, for instance, African Americans, there is also internal colorism. For instance, in New Orleans, there were societies in which there are certain Black people who could not belong unless they could pass a paper bag test, which is if they were darker than the color of a paper bag, they weren't permitted.
That's terrible.
And similarly, but you could see within many groups. So the logic is once you start the hierarchy, I usually say it this way. Race is not simply a concept in which there's an essence like a thing. It also
Mm.
has a practice and a grammar. It's like a game. So
Wow.
although you could change the players, as long as you have the game, you keep reproducing the game. So
Mm.
suppose all of the dark-skinned people were suddenly to disappear. You would still have racism because that game will continue, and the light-skinned people would suddenly start seeing themselves to look for any little way in which they're different that could be marked as inferior or superior.
Yeah.
This happened in many other countries. It happened in places like India, for instance. I teach a course. Well, I teach a variety of courses. I teach courses also on non-Western philosophy, but I'm teaching a course right now on social and political philosophy, a doctoral seminar, in which I decided, instead of doing the usual stuff you do in the United States, where you're just looking at all the Anglo-analytical people who talk about political issues, I decided to spend 1 week on the summary of that approach. And for the rest of the semester, we're reading what I call global Southern political thinkers. After we read Frantz Fanon's Le Damné de la Terre, The Damned of the Earth, where he talked about colonialism and all of that, we read Ambedkar's The Annihilation of Caste. Absolutely brilliant book. Ambedkar pointed out that whatever the history of the Varna system was, and for listeners who are not aware, because a lot of people don't know that caste was the Portuguese term that was brought into India to create the designation. But within Hinduism, the actual term is Varna. And this was linked historically to four classic groups. Just to save time, because we'll spend too much time translating. Let's just say there were the scholarly priestly groups, the military group, you have the mercantile group, and then you have the service group. Okay, so those the classic four groups. And this is similar to what Plato would talked about in the Republic, by the way. Okay, but that original concept, and this is what commentators and critics such as Sri Aurobindo, whom I also teach, very famous. If any of you have not read anything by Sri Aurobindo, read it. Absolutely brilliant. It was the year before he died, he was nominated both for the Nobel Prize in Literature and Peace. Yeah, but he died before he could receive it. But anyway, he pointed out that there's a distinction. This is what Ambedkar pointed out, a distinction between the division of labor and the division of laborers.
Hmm.
The Varna system became such that it moved from a division of labor, where if it's a division of labor, then you look for who's talented to do the labor, into an inherited system that divided laborers, which means no matter how mediocre you are, no matter as a scholar, you're put in the top one, and no matter how talented you are as a merchant, you may be put outside of the merchant group. This created a situation where internal to each group began to make divisions to try to see who. So as we know, even if you're in a service group, some people may say, well, I do this kind of cleaning versus toilets versus streets versus sanitation. Before you know it, so much division in each Varna. That's the historic term, became such that people became separated among themselves, that they began to look for every little difference to mark who is superior and inferior to whom. And this is what the Portuguese observing called caste. And what Ambedkar said, even if the intention wasn't caste, the outcome is caste.
Hmm.
Now, within the caste is not simply from one time. When you bring in, there's no way you're going to have the British Empire, which has whites and racial categories. And now you have the historic Varna system, and then you also have caste categories that don't ultimately take racialized form. So whatever caste was, the fact of the matter is in 21st century India or places where they're East Indians, like in Guyana in the Caribbean, or in Durban, South Africa, or if we look among varieties of people outside, I'm just giving India as an example, but if we could also pick the different African communities, whether they're Luo, Kikoyo, Zulu, Yoruba, or if we go beyond those to different indigenous peoples of the Americas, whether they're Nez Perce, Dene, Wampanoag, all the way through, Nahuatl speaking people, you could tell that my approach to race is not to be purely formalistic. I wish more people who talk about race would go and get to know people, to know the
Mm,
rich diversity of how people are. But as we look through all those categories, what we find is that a meeting of race and caste does happen. And that's
mm,
why there are people using skin lightening creams in India.
yeah.
That's why there are people all over Africa doing the same thing, all over Asia, even in places where people are already light, like in
And they
Korea,
do
North
tanning.
Korea,
And they
and
people do, yeah.
they do everything. So the thing in a nutshell is that that's why I say we have to look at the humanness that's involved,
Mm,
because when we try to look at race in very fixed, narrow categories, we distort the fact that it's a living phenomenon. And as long as people are committed to it, they'll keep producing new ways of making it both live and do its damage.
mm. That's I think a very introspective way of looking at racism and race and how it impacts your life as opposed to just something that's like fixed and solid, something that's ever changing and impacts each person in each culture's life differently. One question that I have that I feel like I'm always toying around with and trying to understand is one of the examples that we just brought up is this form of tribalism and separation of people seems to exist all over the country for so much of human history. I mean, even if you take sports, I mean, it's something that's also completely made up. We've found ways to, wear different logos and signs and say, I'm on this side, you're on that side, our team is better, yours is worse. And we kind of it's become part of so many different things, Democrats, and you can kind of pick any label you want and say this is who I am, this is who you are, and we're better than you for X, Y, and Z reason. So when I think about race in specific, it seems to be if I was a community and I come across a new community for the first time ever, the first things that immediately pop out are probably their skin tone, how they look, right? And so that seems to be the first thing you notice before you figure out anything else about them. Is part of this natural? Is this what's supposed to happen, or what is kind of the natural implications of identifying someone's race versus the value judgments that also come along with it sometimes?
Well, that's one of the big lies we have inherited. It's not natural.
Mm,
If it were natural, our species would have died out a long time ago. Okay,
mm,
because every time people would meet different people, it'll just destroy them.
yeah.
Okay, the actual history of humankind is very different. The the problem is that we have inherited the rationalization of history from warrior societies, from people who have gone through periods of expansionism and conquest. And even those
Mm,
societies were not historically warrior societies. One of the reasons I write on existentialism is that existentialism reminds us that we don't always know who or what we are until we're in situations. The other thing is, remember when I said the game versus the players? Well, some games are games that organize the way we see reality. So if we have a game that says, I can be who I am absolutely without anybody else, then I'm going to meet people on very strange terms. than if I live in a world with a game that says I cannot exist without others. Now,
Mm.
one of the things universally we know about human beings is no human being is born an adult. For a human being to make it even to adolescence requires a whole lot of care. So at the micro familial or community level, the I can be who I am without anybody else narrative just doesn't work. Okay? So a particular misrepresentation of reality has to be brought forth to believe that. The second thing we should bear in mind is that it's a good idea to look at actually what happened when people initially would meet people. For instance, if you look at antiquity, it's amazing how quickly certain technological developments went across continents,
Mm.
really quickly. Whether everything from fire to arrows to different forms of language to nets to wheels to writing, etc. And this is because human beings, when we meet one another, because we're the same species, we're already coordinated to communicative practices of learning from one another.
Mm.
This, this means then that if we think, for example, of something like trade, today, the way we think about markets is very hostile. Self-interest, how do you get rid of the competition, that kind of stuff. That's the business world. But historically, markets were very different. Markets were exciting places where people met to get news. This is where people in the mountains found out what people at the seashore were doing. This is what people at the seashore and the mountain found out what people at the deserts were doing.
Mm.
They often, and in the process, they would learn all kinds of things. Sometimes people would say, I like what you're doing, boy. They go with one another in different places. They they share techniques, they get news, they transform culturally. There's a lot of writing on this. Then there's some people where conflicts happen, things go bad. I would encourage everybody who's listening to this broadcast to read, since we're talking about the Euro-modern age, to read the four voyages of Christopher Columbus.
Mm.
These are the
Is
diaries of,
that a book?
yeah, it's a
I'd love
diary.
to read
Christopher
this.
Columbus wrote down the diaries of his travels.
Whoa.
They're fascinating. They're some of the best readings in this subject. I mean, there are many examples of these. You could also read the diaries of travelers in the Islamic world. You could read diaries that go back with travelers from China when they would visit in the ancient world parts of Africa. You could see travels from Africans traveling to other parts of the world. You see the point, right? If they
Yes.
were able to travel and come back and write about it, then if the world is all about people are going to go kill you and destroy you, that doesn't quite add up.
Mm.
But what's striking is this: circumstances can lead to things falling apart. In Columbus's first voyage, there were little pieces of luck that shifted the story. The fact that he landed in the tiny islands in the Bahamas, where the communities there were so friendly that they didn't even know how to hold swords. Now, here's the thing: when Columbus's men landed, these people were stark naked. These people, because again, the reason they were stark naked, it was warm there and there was nothing to worry about. They they were trading things with one another, and within hours they were communicating. They were learning their languages. And in the process, because Columbus had his ship financed, he needed to find gold because he needed to pay for this. And he noticed they had little bits of gold, and they said, oh, they got them from people from elsewhere. And they pointed the direction the ship sailed in those directions. And again, as luck would have it, because Columbus's voyagers would meet people in positive settings at first, it gave them sufficient time to learn the language, to learn what was going on, and to develop and they began to develop systems of trade. Now, there were, as they went to different islands, bigger islands had people who would show up who were fully clothed, had all kinds of technologies. They began to learn that the people were not homogeneous, that they were a diverse group of people in the Caribbean. Some islands they landed on, they realized there were people who were warrior communities and tried to steal their stuff and capture and enslave them. So they ended up having to fight. So you see where I'm going with this.
Yes.
What they learned was not human nature. What they learned is that there's not a human nature. There are varieties of conditions under which human beings behave in different ways. Now, unfortunately, what's tragic is by the third voyage, no, by the second voyage, things shifted. And by the fourth voyage, the indigenous peoples were enslaved. Things were horrible. Genocide, all kinds of things. So by the time you have Las Casas landing 10 years later, one of the islands in which, for instance, there were 2 million indigenous people were down to 200 within 10 years. Some islands, completely zero, no more indigenous peoples. Part of this was the desperation of the Spaniards to pay back their debt. And of course, not everybody on the ship was good. Remember, I said this is a ship of men. Some of these men seeing naked women were very horny. These men were very horny and began to do all kinds of horrendous things to these women. Some of them, there was a fellow called Rodrigo, who saw this as an opportunity to function like a warlord. So you see what I'm going with the story. Although Columbus landed there thinking, I'm a good dude, he ended up being in a prison several years later as a complete a-hole. And this is the thing that people don't understand about these stories. We always would like to think we're going to be the good guys of history, but we don't know how we're going to behave in circumstances, especially when we're desperate to do things like pay debts, when we're in situations where we're looking for fame, when we're in situations where we even may have an inferiority complex. Some people want to show up their fathers, or they desperately want to please their mothers. In other words, we too often try to find a single essential element that will reveal a story. But we often need to know how many elements work together. If you think of the Ottomans as an example, the Ottomans, these were Turks who became Muslims, and eventually there was an Ottoman Empire. Well, the Ottomans had every opportunity to go to the Atlantic, but they didn't. They focused more on the East. So they did not, if had they done so, we probably would have had a very different history. Similarly, when we look at the different Chinese dynasties, when they landed in the east coast of Africa, it's reputed that there were also Chinese ships who made it to the Americas. We look all over the Pacific Islands. There were also different issues that they had because their conceptions of how to relate politically was fundamentally connected to how you develop relationships, how you develop diplomatic agreements with people. They had full expectations that people were not to be like them. There were Chinese ships on which you could put, it's estimated, up to maybe 80 of Columbus's ships on one of these Chinese ships. This
Oh,
is how
wow.
huge these things were. Could you imagine these monstrosities coming into shore? You know what I mean? To trade.
Yeah.
So they easily, if they wanted to, could have been a colonial colonizing presence. But if we go back with the story, here's the thing. In my book, Fair Black Consciousness, I talk about this in more detail. You see, it's not one value, but a constellation of values. The people of Christendom, Columbus and his men, Isabella and Ferdinand saw themselves when they defeated the Moors. They didn't define it as liberating Spain or even Portugal. They called it the reconquest. Now think about it. If your mentality is that the world is right if you're the conqueror, then you carry that value system with you. Second, they had Christianity, a value system premised upon purity, which meant that it had in its logic how to separate the pure from the impure. Third, it had the notion of superiority versus inferiority. Next, it had a Manichaean value system.
Which means?
Manichaeanism, yeah, Manichaeanism comes from Persia, from Persian Christians. Mani was called, like an apostle of God, and they believed in the physical separation of good and evil, and they defined good as light and evil as dark. So if you're coming with the idea that the lighter you are, the better, and the darker you are, the worst, and then you add into that a theodicy. And for listeners who don't know what a theodicy is how do you account for the complete goodness of God and God's power through separating God from all evil. You do this by ultimately claiming there are evil people in the world separate from God. This is how you can have people outside of God. And then you argue there's some people connected to God.
Hmm.
Well, you come with this idea that you have to separate the evil from the good, then you're going to have a rationalization that if you slaughter all groups of people, or if you bring diseases in which they begin to die, it is the will of God.
Hmm.
So if you put all those mixtures together, you have a rationalization that you're able to conquer them because you're better. You're able to live because you're better. You have this notion that people's suffering is a function of their fault. And you bring those mixtures together, you're going to have these kinds of outcomes. Even the term tribes and tribalism, there weren't tribes before. That was something, tribals is something that comes from the Roman Empire. It was actually a system of rule. But the imposition of it shifted into a notion of primitivism to say that there are certain people who belong to the past, not to the future. If you think of the logic to say that you belong to the future, it means that everything you do in the present is to sanitize yourself to purify the future. That creates a group of people who are locked in the past and are called primitives, and the identity of tribes was imposed upon them. Many,
Hmm.
many of the groups had their own terms. They were more ethnic groups. They had terms, as we know. For instance, when you and I were speaking before, we found out we're connected in a way in terms of Tamil Nadu. And that's the point. What people call themselves, it's not tribes, naturally. That is something that was imposed. And in tribalism, an imposition is a notion of unanimism, that somehow everybody in the tribe cannot think and be different. But in truth, every human community has difference. Like everywhere I've gone, and I've been all over the planet, you'll find a history of people going through processes of disagreement and trying to figure out a better way to do whatever they do culturally.
Hmm.
So I know my answer was a bit long-winded, so the upshot is it's not natural.
Yeah.
But the people who become dominant rationalize it as natural
Hmm.
to alleviate themselves of the responsibility for their actions.
Wow. What I'm hearing you say is that there were certain narratives in our history that have caused certain behaviors, and because that's what we ended up inheriting, we now believe that that's the natural course of what would have happened regardless if another narrative had taken over.
Correct.
Dang. I had never That's so interesting actually, because the only way I mean, okay, then how is it possible to get a grasp of what is human nature then? Is that even possible? Because then anytime you look at a certain behavior, you can just say, well, this was influenced by something else that had happened. And so can we ever get a gauge of human nature?
The short answer is there is no such thing as human nature. There is a human condition. Okay. And this is because a fundamental aspect of the human condition is freedom. To be a human being is not properly to be. You see, we say the word human being, but that's actually a false notion. Human life, human reality is a condition of possibility. And because of that, human beings are constantly dealing with the production of the environment we live in. Human beings require, for instance, a world of meaning in which to live. If you take meaning out, we go through despair, we die. Many other creatures, whatever meaning may be for them, is very different. For many other creatures, they don't need to worry about certain things that we worry about because of the level of signification in their life. A lion is not going to say sorry to the antelope. The lion is just going to eat it, kill it and eat it. But a human being could go through this experience of identification with the antelope and decide to become a vegetarian. A human being can begin to posit the possibility of her, his, or their non-existence and ask a question such as, well, what preceded me and what will succeed me? We live with an awareness that our individual life is not the end-all be-all of everything. But we also live with an awareness that our species is not the be-all, end-all of everything. We also live with the realization that existence, being, all of reality, doesn't have any reason to give a damn about us. In other words, if we never ever had popped up, well, first, we wouldn't be having this conversation. If we have to conclude, that wouldn't have been bad. But we did pop up. And this is why people like Aurobindo or Kaiji Nishitani from Japan, they're very important to read. Because what they point out is that once we pop up, we produce the kind of world in which we matter for one another. We do this through a constellation of activities ranging from art. Every time we see something artistic, even the sign behind you on the screen is a transformation of a space into a place. We decorate, we transform food, we do all kinds of things that say to us as human beings that we matter so much that receiving even joy becomes something for which we have a right. Tasty food, even a pinch of salt, a little bit of pepper, or even when we sit down, when we have conversations, or when we just sometimes just hold one another's hands. We're making affirmations of the value of what it is to live in this world together, a world that doesn't have to care about us. So once we see this, of course, it occasions also fear and trembling, as Kierkegaard and Martin Luther would say. And the reason it does is because if we don't do it, it won't happen. You see? We would love to believe that there are gods who are going to come out of the sky and give us love. We would love to believe narcissistically that if we were not born, reality would be infinitely at a loss. But we're lying to ourselves. It's the people who love us for whom, if we were not born, the world would be infinitely worse.
Mm.
And that's why love is so important.
Yeah. I mean, and so in relation to I got lost. I got lost in your train of thought. I'm trying to think back to where we had what the question was.
Oh, it was about nature. And
Yes.
yeah, the question is, yeah, I the reason I do a lot of work in existentialism is, look, existentialism, sure, we have hands, feet, we have, a certain number of chromosomes, all kinds of stuff. However, there's a basic principle in logic, okay? The principle in logic, you studied computers, so you know this, is what's called a complete sentence or a well-formed formula. A well-formed formula is a sentence that can be a law, okay? It is consistent, it covers all of the rules that govern it, okay? Well, if we were well-formed formulae, then it would mean that we'd be all absolutely predictable. If
Hmm.
you drop a pig in a river and there are crocodiles there, they'll go eat a pig. If they don't eat a pig, there are two conclusions. One, they're not hungry. Two, if they are hungry, they don't eat a pig, maybe they're sick. You see what I'm saying? But if you put a bunch of human beings who are hungry next to a river and you drop a pig in, you don't know what will happen. Some might go eat the pig, might go kill it and eat it. Some may say, nah, I don't eat pork. They can make a decision to adhere to a cultural norm. Some may say, oh, I do eat pork, but I can't kill a pig. I find it offensive to kill an animal. Some may say, the list could go on. In other
Yeah.
words, the predictability of human action is not foreclosed. This is something that human beings have struggled with in mythic literature. If you look at all mythic literature, there are these moments in which we struggle with the human condition of possibility. Nature requires having laws. The nature of a thing is connected to laws. That means it cannot act otherwise. The human world is a world in which we can act otherwise. And this is why, from philosophers to moralists, we all meet around this view, which is, if you walk in a room and you're accused of having harmed another human being, you cannot use as an excuse, it's my nature.
Hmm.
You see? This
Yeah.
is why we hold people accountable for their actions. If it were in human nature, then we can't, right now, we're dealing with issues around genocide. We've dealt with issues with genocide before. We hold communities accountable for their actions. And there are times they get away with it, not because of uh, 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 a conclusion that it was right. It's just that people just didn't have the strength or the wherewithal or the power to do something about it. But the human world is a world of possibility and responsibility.
Hmm.
Our natural parts, yes, we are natural. We have to eat, we have to sleep, we pass fecal matter, we reproduce, we get sick, we're born, and we die. Those are all natural. But that's only part of the reality. Those are the conditions that enable us to do lots of other things. Create,
Hmm.
create language, ideas, virtual
Yeah.
reality, all of those things we create.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, to think of humans like that, I guess, one thing that was coming up to mind when you were speaking is that, especially with the alligator and the human comparison, it feels that you could argue that perhaps humans are still limited, but just in a far larger sense than an alligator would be. So even with that pig example, there may be 10,000 possible decisions, but not five. But the question then I guess as an academic, or the fact that you're in academia, it seems like so much of what happens in academia is trying to understand human behavior. I mean, especially when it comes to policy, and when it's trying to understand, okay, what will lead X, Y, and Z to happen. So if you want to if you want to reduce the amount of addiction to nicotine, for example, like, you have to then make certain decisions that predict that that behavior will then happen, and then only is that policy effective. Or even when you think about education, when it's like, what types of policies will, improve literacy rates, there has to be some, if we take X, we are likely predicting that Y will happen. Otherwise, it seems that if it's all just random and there's not really enough predictability that's there, then all the research that's happening is kind of just bogus. I don't know,
Yeah, it's not all random at all. The mistake we make sometimes is we create false dilemmas. False dilemmas are all or nothing.
Hmm.
So it's either all random or everything is necessary, right? It's all determined, and that's false.
Yeah.
The thing that we should bear in mind is that for us even to have language, for us to communicate, we have to have generalizations. If we didn't have generalizability, we can't teach another human being a single thing, because everything
Yeah.
will be absolutely once.
Yeah. Yes.
The mistake is overgeneralization.
Hmm.
Overgeneralization turns something that's general and transforms it into absolute. General is sufficient for meaning. And remember, I said we live in a world of meaning. I teach courses on philosophy of social sciences and human sciences. A fundamental thing in the human sciences is how we're able to communicate with one another. In the human world, there's behavior. We know behavior takes many forms. Basically behavior is anything we do. Okay. And there's action. Action is connected to behaviors that have specific meaning in them. 5 people could go to the store. So we could write down the behavior. They walked into the store. However, as we know, people go to the store for cigarettes, people go to the store for milk, people who go
Hmm.
to the store to flirt with the cashier, people who go to the store to steal, people go to the store to hang out with their friends. You see where I'm getting at?
Yeah, the reasons could be infinite.
The reasons are many.
Yeah.
Part of the task is for us to learn what the reasons are, because in learning what the reasons are affect the actions and the behavior that we
Hmm.
report. I put it this way: the human world is contingent, but not accidental. You
And
see,
contingent means?
contingent means could be otherwise.
Hmm.
You see, that's the part. See, what laws are about what could not be otherwise. They're absolute. The principle of conservation in physics, a law, cannot be otherwise. The relationship of energy to matter. When the velocity shifts, energy cools, you have matter. If you can accelerate the matter, it can become isomorphic with energy. Boom, that's a law. If you have hydrogen and 2 oxygen molecules, you got water, a law. But with the human world, it's very different. The human world is a world in which there's deliberation, there's action.
Hmm.
And in that world, we have to learn not simply what we mean, but what others mean. And this enables us to have human science. But human science functions very differently than other kinds of science, because when you're looking, for instance, in the science of geology, you're not asking what the rock means. You're simply asking what the rock does. But in the world of human science, you must also ask, what are people doing? And when you're saying that, you
Hmm.
mean, what do they mean in their actions? You see?
Not just looking at what they are doing, but yeah, why did they do that?
Why did they do it? And in knowing why they did it, you could also find ways for them to do otherwise. So for a lot of the other examples you bring up, you need a sufficient level of generalization to understand what is going on. But because there are those who don't do it, it gives sufficient room to be able to give an explanation for why people may be able to do something otherwise.
Mm.
You see?
Mm-hmm.
And it can work for some people who do things otherwise in such a way that some things can catch on. There are a lot of things people do today that have changed the meanings of what they were before. There are a lot of things we do today that in the past had religious meanings. They were ritualized. But it turns out they were also very practical. For instance, washing your hands before you eat. It's a good way not to get food poisoning. Washing your hands before you cook is a good way not to infect people. But in the past, some people did it as a purification ritual for the gods. Today, we don't often do it for that. We do it because it's clean. But nevertheless, it's the same action. And
But
it
the
has
meaning has changed.
the meaning has changed, and it has the same outcome because it means fewer people die from food poisoning. And there are many other things that we do. So the thing that we should bear in mind is to take seriously what it is to live in a world of meaning. But also, we live in a world of learning. This is the thing we forget. One of the misrepresentations, for instance, of when human communities meet is when we have the colonial model, we just have one community bouldering over another. But that's complete nonsense. Even the community who ends up dominating ends up adopting a lot of the practices of the people they dominate.
Mm.
Because some of the things the people they dominate do are very cool and very useful. The other thing we should bear in mind is that we often commit a fallacy when we look at how communities meet. The fallacy, the technical word for the fallacy is isomorphism of translation. And what this means is basically you presume that each community has all of reality absolutely contained in its experiences and language. Now, if this were really true, then there's nothing one community could learn from another. But what the reality is that every community has things that every human community shares. For instance, everybody eats, everybody drinks, everybody has sex, everybody gets sick, everybody finds a way to find cures, everybody laughs. That's what everybody does. However, not everybody lives in places that are very cold. Not everybody lives in places that are very hot and humid. Not everybody lives in places that's very dry. Not everybody lives in places that have a lot of fish. Not everybody lives in
Yeah.
places that have a lot of animals of other kinds, etc. So because people live in places that are different, they may have developed different experiences, that they have developed cultural and linguistic resources to enable them to negotiate and live with.
Mm.
So when they meet people from the other places, the things we all have, those are the things they can map on to share. And that's how we're able to start a language.
Mm.
But at a certain point, one group notices a word in another language that they have no reference point for in their own because they just have no experience of it. What is interesting is when that happens, what that community does, in other words, the ignorant community, is simply learn the new word or the new sentence. And similarly, the other community may learn something from the other community. And before you know it, so for instance, and this always happens, there are all these terms. Because my family is so mixed, we also have a lot of languages. It it's very funny. My wife is from South Africans who are Ashkenazic Jews, who are from Ukrainians, Belarusians, Germans, and Russians and Poles. Okay. she grew up in a black neighborhood in Chicago when they migrated to the U.S. When we got together and we had children, one of the funny things is because we're both Jews, but very different kind of Jews, because I'm from what people would call Beta Israel and Arab Jews and Sephardic Jews, okay? But I'm Jamaican. So when our kids are born, and we're growing up, there are a lot of jokes I love to speak in patois and other languages. And because of, in my childhood, because of the Chinese side, they spoke Cantonese, I can hear words in Cantonese and Mandarin that many English speakers can't hear. And because of the presence of Tamil and other languages mixed in the patois in Jamaica, there's sounds I can hear that a lot of other people cannot hear. Similarly, because of growing up in New York, I could hear things also in Yiddish. And my wife, because of her family's background, was spoken Yiddish and English and blah, blah. And also because we connect in South Africa, I could hear certain sounds. And because of the Scottish background, I could do the clicks and so forth. So whenever I'm interviewed in South Africa, for instance, I would say the word Oza, and you heard the click, Oza. But whatever happens, people are shocked to the radio, like, oh my God, he could say you see what I'm saying? Because I have the muscles in my face developed for it. Now, because of that, my children can do that. Now, what's funny is when my wife at first met a lot of my extended Jamaican family, there are a lot of words we use that have no translation in the English language, but she knows the words. And they start cracking up. They're like, oh, this woman understands. You know what I mean? And then they start questioning, you know what I mean? They say, maybe she's just a light-skinned black woman, because they're, you know what I mean? Or maybe she's a light-skinned, they really, you see what I'm saying? Now, clearly she learned it because if it's part of everyday speech, you'd acquire it. So what we know about this is if you start using another language, at first you don't know the word meaning, but eventually one day you say, oh my goodness, I know what the word means. And then somebody say, great, translate it. And then you'd say, I can't, right?
Yeah.
I give you an example. There's a Jamaican word you probably seen heard in movies. It's called cho.
Mm.
I can't translate it.
Can
But
you
but
use
but
it in a, can you use it in a context? Use an
sure.
example.
Cho, what you are doing? Right?
It's like a way to get attention, kind of.
No, it's an actual meaning.
Ah.
It's a term. It's an interjection. It has many meanings, you see?
Ah.
Yeah. So yeah, cho, right? It can mean anything from pejorative terms to positive terms. How you use it, it's what's crucial. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and there are others. For instance, a lot of people don't know there's certain things that are words that people don't realize, like kissing the teeth.
Hmm.
When someone says, "Oh, what you doing?" Right? It's a word. For instance, in Southern Bantu-oriented languages, these are all different consonants. Those are all separate, and they mean
Hmm.
different things. You see? And there are others too, but my point is that if you hang around with people long enough, and if you would like to know somebody who has written, there are many linguists who have written on this, but a philosopher who has written on it is the late Kwasi Wiredu. It's in a book called Cultural Universals and Particulars.
Hmm.
What he points out is you pick any human community, it doesn't matter how radically different the languages are. Put them in a room for a day. The truth is, within minutes, they're communicating. And within a day, it's not, they're beginning to speak one another's language. Eventually, there will be terms that each would learn that are not translatable in the other's language, but they can learn it.
Hmm.
And And this is because once we've developed the synaptical functions for language, we now have the syntactical, grammatical framework to learn other languages. That's all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, in some cases, there are sounds we can't hear if we have not been introduced to those sounds by the age of 7. But that is very different. You see, and this happens a lot with, for instance, East Asian and Southern African in many of the languages. But that's why, for instance, native English speakers, when they meet people who speak Mandarin, Cantonese, or varieties of Southeast Asian languages, they, they for them, the English sounds like a lot of sounds, and that's because the audio, the hearing range is
Mm.
much broader. So for the East Asian or the South Asian, or for people, like when people say we speak with an accent, it's because we're literally trying to squeeze our broad hearing capacity into a small audio spectrum.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to, I feel like I keep losing myself in you have so many facts and details. I keep losing myself in the flow because I think when I come back to what we were originally talking about, I always am like, where did we go? Because okay, so we were talking about the let me do a rewind real quick because I had asked, do you remember by any chance? Let me
Yeah,
think.
well, the original one was you asked me about human nature and whether it's
Yes.
tribalism.
Yes, no,
Yeah.
and then we went into the alligator and humans just having a finite number of choices. And then how do we get into language?
Oh, because I was trying to explain that it's an error to say it's an all or nothing game. Either
Yes.
we're all nature or we're all random. And I'm saying we're
Yes.
not random.
Yeah.
We produce organized, principled meaning that we
Got it.
share.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. And then I guess for my final question for you to kind of touch it back into the concept of race and something a lot of people in policy work, I think, work a lot in, is when you do some work in this concept of liberation. And so I would love to kind of hear your understanding of what this word means to you, and especially in the context of race. And perhaps is that a possible world that exists? What does that look like?
Okay, I'll try to be shorter with this one. The short answer is yes, a possible world exists, right? In a sense, not exists in the sense that it is here now, it's that we have to build it. Liberation is basically moving from an oppressive, shackled condition. It's breaking the chains, okay? But liberation is only part of the story. You see, to be liberated doesn't mean to be free. This is this mistake people make. They think liberation is freedom. No, it isn't. Liberation is just simply the absence of constraints that that enable you now to do the real work. And the real work is to build a livable world. Okay? So uh, a lot of what we talked about before, when I talked about possibility, human condition, the meanings we could build, the world we could live in, all of that stuff, that is what's connected to freedom. It's when oppression is when we block people's capacity to build meaningful lives. Okay? That's what oppression ultimately is. Racism is the disempowering of people's ability to use their power to live livable lives. And I should add that I look at power very differently than most people do. One of the lies we have is connected to the earlier question of human nature. The lies we have is that power is exclusively coercive. There are people who say power corrupts and all of that stuff. Well, that's only if you have power over people. That's only if you dominate people. But if we understand that what power is the ability to make things happen with access to the conditions of doing so, then we can never get through a day without power. You can't get up without power. You and I couldn't communicate right now without power. However, the conditions, for instance, the condition right now is the internet, the Zoom network we're using, the fact that the people before us who set the conditions for these, and the fact that Ada Lovelace set up the algorithm for the computer, the fact that Grace Walker worked out wireless technology and Addie Lamar worked those out, the fact that Lewis Latimer figured out how to make the telephone and to figure out the filament for light so we could have audio visuality, those are all conditions, but they didn't hold those conditions from the rest of humanity. When we make the condition, give people access to the conditions, they're able to exemplify power. So oppression, racism, all of those isms, sexism, ethnic, all of those, from homophobia to all of that stuff, classism, all of those are blocking the conditions people need to live meaningful lives. If we unleash those conditions, then, now people can work at building homes. They could build, and when I say homes, I don't simply mean like physical places. I mean home also allegorically, metaphorically, places in which people belong with dignity and respect. So, and these homes I call freedom. I usually characterize it this way. There's a famous adage from Audre Lorde. She's a Caribbean poet and feminist theorist and queer theorist. Audre Lorde said the master's tools cannot tear down the master's house. But I add, my wife Jane Anna Gordan and I add, but we should remember that masters don't build houses. It's the enslaved, the workers, the people who build houses. That a lot of the tools, the way I talked about language, that we have, it's humanity who brought those tools. And we can use those tools to build better houses. If we build a lot of better houses that people can live in, then the so-called master's house loses the power of mastery, because for it to have mastery, it has to block other people's access. So if we open the access that humanity has, then, then a person who hates is just an individual who hates. I don't care about him, her, or them. They just hate me. However, if they have access to the conditions that block my capacity, yours, and the vast number of humankind's ability to live, now we have a problem. So liberation is a necessary but insufficient condition. After liberation, we got to build a world of freedom, dignity, meaning, and respect.
Wow. Yeah, wow. There's so much more to dive into. I feel like if you have the time, I would love to have you on again, because I feel like we briefly touched on a few existential thoughts and ideas, but I'm so excited to get into all the work that you do in existentialism perhaps later. I mean, I think there is so much to get into what you said. I think one of the biggest things, my biggest takeaways from this conversation has been maybe looking at history through a different lens, which is not that things happened the way they happened because it was part of human nature, but perhaps that certain narratives and some people happen to just win out in key moments where their particular view or their particular perspective just carried forward. And I mean, I think that's a drastically different way of looking at history, rather than being like, okay, this happened because it was meant to happen in some ways. And so, yeah, well, thank you so much for your time and sharing all of these things.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me. And yeah, let's do a part 2. And you got it. The mistake we make is we create over-determinism. The fact that it could have been otherwise means that we have the responsibility of making the future different.
It doesn't.
Nobody else is going to do it. It doesn't have to continue.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.